Welcome to A Jew and a Gentile Discuss, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Ezra Benjamin.
And I'm Berna.
And we're your hosts for this podcast. So before we jump into what this podcast is about, we're going to give you a quick background on why you should even consider listening. But don't worry, we're not going to get into our grade school accomplishments, though I did win Best Nuclear Power Plant Replica in 5th grade. I just want you all to know that. Anyways, we digress. My name's Ezra. I've spent the last decade or so working at an organization called Jewish Voice in Phoenix, Arizona. Jewish Voice exists to transform lives and to see all Israel saved, and we do that by proclaiming the gospel first to the Jew. And I've spent the last decade and traveled around the world leading about 40 or so medical outreaches specifically to what's called the lost tribes of Israel living in Central Asia, in India, and Africa and beyond. And we're going to get more into what that means in a little bit. I have a degree in business and finance from Liberal Arts College in Chicago, and after that I first worked at a faith-based nonprofit in the Chicagoland area. But I came to Jewish Voice in 2010 after coming as a volunteer on one of the outreaches because I was realizing that the idea of the priority in the scriptures of Jewish ministry is really neglected in the Christian nonprofit world. And I felt like God was really speaking to me that that needed to be a priority for me like it was a priority to him. And so I moved across the country from Chicago to Phoenix and got involved at Jewish Voice. So I suppose, Carly, I'm the token or the delegate Jewish representative in this conversation. I celebrate Hanukkah. My family celebrates Hanukkah, Passover. I don't wear a kippah or a yarmulke on my head when I walk down the street, and I'll explain why in a little while. That could actually take a whole episode to unpack. But more importantly, I also believe, like you do, that Jesus is the Messiah, and that's what we have in common.
Yep, totally. And I'll talk about the things we have in common. But the difference is I'm Carly. I've been working at Jewish Voice for over 6 years. My role at Jewish Voice is to find others who care about the mission of Jewish Voice, which is to transform lives and see all Israel saved, and connect them with Jewish Voice so they can live out their mission that's similar as ours through what we're doing, whether that's financial or volunteering.
Right.
We just want to find other partners that can connect with us.
Right.
I have a couple of degrees in business, my undergrad and my graduate degree. I worked at a local nonprofit in Phoenix, tried my hand at starting my own business, so I love kind of entrepreneurship. I teach business currently, and I'm going to seminary because I just can never learn enough about theology, basically. I'm not Jewish, but I am the Gentile Christian of this discussion, so I celebrate all the Christian holidays, right. Christmas, Easter, and all the ones in between. So like Ezra said, although we come from different backgrounds, we have some things in common. First, we both have faith that Jesus is the Messiah. We believe that God is doing something unique among Jewish people in the world. And we believe the importance of the church and that Christians need to understand their importance and what their role is in order to fulfill what God's doing in the world today. So why should you listen to us?
Yeah, it's a great question, Carly. The podcast is to accomplish a couple of things. First of all, it's to help our listeners understand what's going on in the world from a biblical worldview. But sometimes when we hear that term biblical worldview, we think Christian evangelical worldview. We're going to talk about biblical worldview in terms of both Old and New Testament, the God of Israel, who is the God of Christians. And look at it from those two different perspectives, as a Jewish believer, which I am, and as a Gentile Christian, which you are. One of the verses that you'll hear again and again as you listen to us is Romans 1:16, and Paul's speaking to the church at Rome, and he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, of the good news of Jesus, because it's the power of God to salvation for all who believe, for anyone who believes. First to the Jew, and sometimes actually, like where I used to work, we would put this verse up, but we put an ellipses, ... after to anyone who believes, and we cut it because it's hard to understand. What does it mean first to the Jew? We're going to unpack that more. The Greek word there, I'm not a Greek scholar, but I looked a little bit into it, is proton, and it's the idea of necessary firstness. What is God doing in saying it's necessary to first proclaim the good news to Jewish people? We're going to talk all about that because it has a powerful part in what God's doing in the world.
Why do you think Paul specifically explains that? Is that something that's important to God, or why does he say the Jew first?
Sure, and it's interesting here because he's not speaking to a Jewish audience. He's not preaching to the choir, so to speak. He's speaking to a predominantly non-Jewish audience in Rome. And I think Paul understood that as the church is growing, and at this point the scales have probably tipped where the majority of new believers are not Jewish, he's having to explain, you need to understand the root of the thing. The root of the thing is that God has always had a plan and a dream for the Jewish people, and it's culminating in their faith in the Messiah whom he sent. And so I think he's just continuing to keep that on the radar, and we need to keep it on the radar today. That's part of what this whole podcast is about, keeping on the radar for Christians that what God's doing among Jewish people and what that means for them is central to our faith.
So if someone's listening, what can they expect from us?
Yeah, what you can expect is a couple things. You can expect relevant topics. These aren't kind of, we are going to talk about the history of the modern state of Israel and what happened in the Holocaust and World War II a little bit, but you can also expect to hear what's happening now. It's 2020. What's happening today, and not just what's happening, but what does that have to do with prophecies, with biblical promises, with tenets of our faith and our theology, which have been in existence for a few thousand years. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what Christianity and Judaism have to do with anything. We're going to talk about how we disagree. And is there a place where we can come together as a Jewish believer, as a Gentile believer, and say, yeah, we have common ground? Or are these two entirely separate identities? And maybe it's a little from column A and a little from column B. We're going to unpack all of that. Lots of exciting topics.
Right. So you might be asking, how is this different than any other Christian podcast that you listen to? Hopefully, like Ezra explained, you can see we have two very different perspectives, a Jewish believer and a Gentile believer. And although we have similarities that we discussed, we come from different backgrounds and can bring our different viewpoints to look at things through a biblical perspective.
Right.
And we hope that we're giving you tools and equipping you and informing you to relate to other believers around you, Jewish people around you, and to better understand what's going on in the world today.
Absolutely. And Carly, one more thing we're going to do is give our listeners the opportunity to get involved in what ministries like Jewish Voice are doing around the world. God is active in the lives of Jewish communities. He's active in the lives and the destinies of all peoples and nations, but we're specifically focused on what he's doing among Jewish people, and maybe even Jewish communities our audience has never heard of before.
Yeah.
So we're going to tell you how you can get more involved. So if you want to hear more episodes or subscribe to this podcast wherever you access your podcast content, or we'd love it, in fact, if you'd actually leave us a review, what you think about what you've heard and what questions you have that weren't answered and what you'd like to hear that we haven't talked about, please do so. You can also follow us on social media at the handle A Jew and a Gentile Discuss, or directly on our website, www.ajewandagentilediscuss.org.